The well stood in the center of the village like a silent witness to everything that ever happened there. It was an old American settlement, built on land that once belonged to the Apache. The year was in the late 1800s, time when dust hung heavy over dirt roads and the sound of boots striking wooden porches carried farther than laughter ever did. The town was small, nothing more than a handful of cabins, a saloon, a church, and that well that had quenched generations of thirst. To most it was just part of the village. But on one night it became something else entirely, a place of fear, of silence, of cruel decision. That evening, lanterns glowed weakly inside windows, while coyotes howled from the dark edges of the prairie. Folks gathered near the well, whispering in nervous tones, their faces lit by moonlight and fire from torches. They had made up their minds, though few dared to speak of it out loud. In the center of it all was the Apache woman, her wrists bound, her dark hair tangled, her eyes reflecting a mixture of fire and sorrow. She did not fight. She only looked at the villagers as though she already knew how this story would end. Rumors had always followed her. Some said she carried the old ways in her blood, whispering to the wind and the animals. Others claimed she was cursed, that misfortune followed whenever she lingered too long near their homes. But in truth she was simply different. And in a time when fear was stronger than mercy, different was enough to condemn someone. No lawman stood that night to question the act. No preacher raised his voice to stop it. The village worked like one body, pushing her forward. Their silence heavy with guilt they would not name. She pleaded once, her voice breaking the tense stillness. She begged them to see her not as an enemy, but as a woman who bled the same as they did, who carried hope the same as they did. Yet the crowd hardened, each villager clinging to their own fear of what might happen if they chose compassion. When her cries echoed, some turned their heads away. Others clenched their jaws, but not a single hand loosened the rope. The moment the rope was cut, her body fell into the blackness of the well. A hollow splash rose up, followed by a silence so deep it pressed against every chest. For an instant, it seemed the earth itself held its breath. Then came the sound, her voice rising from the depths, raw and desperate, crying for help. It was not just the cry of a woman in danger. It was the cry of a human soul, begging not to be forgotten. The villagers froze. Children clung to their mothers. Men shifted uneasily. Women pressed trembling hands to their lips. Her voice rose again, echoing against the stone, filling the air with a haunting plea that could not be ignored. And yet, one by one, they walked away. They told themselves it was better not to listen, better to forget. The well could keep her secret, and the prairie winds would carry her cries away. That was the choice they made, but not everyone could turn their back. On the far side of the gathering, standing slightly apart from the rest, was a man who had always walked his own path. His figure was strong, his frame shaped by years of labor under the sun. His skin carried the bronze of heritage, his black hair tied loosely behind him. His chest bare under the moonlight, marked with small tribal tattoos that told stories older than the village itself. Around his neck hung simple pieces of tribal jewelry, tokens of a people who had lived close to the land long before cabins and saloons rose from it. He watched the villagers leave. He watched as the last lantern light disappeared into homes and the voices of the crowd faded into silence. Still, the cries from the well did not stop. They pierced the night, growing weaker, filled with a mixture of fear and fading strength. He could not unhear them. The man had never been welcome in the village, not fully. He was tolerated, respected for his strength and skill, but always kept at a distance. They said he was caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. Yet it was this distance that now held him apart from their cruelty. He had no fear of the old stories, no need to carry the burden of their suspicions. What he heard from the well was not the voice of a curse, nor the voice of an enemy. It was the voice of life, the voice of a woman begging to be seen. He stepped closer. The night air cool on his skin, his bare chest rising with each careful breath. He looked into the darkness of the well, though he could see nothing. Only the sound guided him, thin and trembling, but real. "Help me." The words floated up, carrying the weight of both despair and hope. The man crouched, his strong hands gripping the rough edge of the stones, his muscles tense. He listened again, his heart pounding against his ribs. Around him, the village lay still, shutters closed, doors bolted. No one else would come. No one else would answer. The prairie stretched endlessly beyond the stars above, silent witnesses to all that had been done. Somewhere, far in the distance, a train whistle cried into the night. A reminder that the world beyond this village kept moving, never pausing for the suffering of one soul. Yet here, in this place, choice still hung heavy in the air. The man knew that to act was to stand against everyone he had known in this village. To climb into that well was to risk not only his own life, but the anger of the people who had abandoned hers. Still, his blood burned with the knowledge that silence was a heavier burden than danger. He leaned forward, calling into the darkness. His voice was deep, steady, carrying a promise even he had not fully shaped yet. "I hear you," the cries quieted, as though the woman below feared the silence had finally claimed her. Then, after a long pause, her voice rose again, weaker this time, but filled with the spark of recognition. "Please, don't leave me." The man pressed his palm to the stones, the rough surface biting into his skin. He knew this was no small choice. This was a moment that would decide not only her fate, but his own. The village would not forgive what he was about to do. They had turned her into a ghost before her time. And now he was daring to bring her back. The night grew colder, the stars sharper, the world holding its breath once more. The cries from the well became softer, fading, as though life itself was slipping away. He had only moments, and then he began to move. His muscles coiled, his mind sharp, his spirit steady. He reached for the length of rope left discarded by the villagers, testing its weight in his hands. The silence of the empty square wrapped around him, broken only by the faint echo of her voice. Every step he took toward, the edge felt like a step away from the life he had known. He peered into the blackness again, gripping the rope tighter. The stone rim was cold beneath his fingers. Below, the woman's cries trembled in the dark. "Hold on," he whispered, though he did not know if she could still hear, with one last look at the empty square. At the homes where fear kept everyone hiding, he steadied himself, and then, without another thought, he began his descent into the well, toward the voice no one else would answer. The rope creaked. The stones closed around him. The night swallowed his figure until he was only a shadow slipping into the earth. Above, the stars burned brightly, but they gave no answers. Below, the unknown waited. The rope groaned under his weight as he lowered himself slowly into the well, his bare feet scraping against the damp stones. The night air grew colder the deeper he went, carrying with it the heavy smell of earth and stagnant water. Each sound echoed strangely, his breathing bouncing off the walls, mingling with the faint sobs drifting up from below. He had known darkness before on lonely trails and in nights when storms swallowed the land, but this was different. This was the darkness of something hidden, something the village wanted to bury forever. His muscles flexed as he steadied himself, careful not to slip, careful not to let the rope burn through his hands. He thought of the faces that had turned away, of the silence that had followed her fall. The village had always carried secrets, but never one like this. Now he carried the weight of that choice alone. The woman's voice rose again, weaker, trembling. "Please, don't let me die here." He paused, his heart hammering, trying to judge how far below she was. His eyes strained, but the darkness was too thick. He spoke, his voice steady, carrying strength she could cling to. "I'm coming. Don't let go of hope." Every inch down felt like stepping further into exile. He knew the people above would not forgive him for this. To them, the Apache woman was a shadow of their fears, a reminder of land they had taken and lives they did not understand. They called her cursed, but he knew better. He had seen the way she tended to the sick child of a settler when no one else would come near. How she left offerings at the edge of the fields when rain would not come. Her difference was not danger, but the village had chosen to believe lies rather than truth. The rope swayed slightly as his weight shifted, his hands burning from the rough hemp. He thought of the life he had led on the edges of this place. He was not fully one of them, though he lived near their cabins and worked their land when coin was scarce. He was tolerated, never embraced. They respected his strength, his skill with horses, his way with the wild land. But he was never invited into their homes as a brother. Some whispered about his blood, about the tribal jewelry he wore, about the tattoos on his chest that told stories older than their fences. To them, he was half their world and half another. That was enough reason to keep their distance. Perhaps it was this distance that allowed him to hear what they refused to hear. The woman's cries were not curses, but the sound of someone clinging to life. He wondered if she had felt the same isolation he had, always seen as other, never enough. At last, his feet touched something soft and wet. The rope loosened in his hands as he crouched low, the cold water rising around his ankles. The air down there was heavy, thick with the smell of stone and moss. His fingers searched blindly until they brushed against skin cold. Trembling, she gasped at his touch, as though fearing it was only a ghost's hand. "You came. I told you I would," he answered, his voice steady, though inside he felt the weight of her fear. He lifted her carefully, her body frail in his arms, her soaked clothing clinging to her thin frame. She was shivering, her breath ragged, but she was alive. Above them, the mouth of the well was only a pale circle of light, distant as the moon. The rope swayed against the stones, their only way out. He looked at it, then at her, his mind racing. He could not climb with both of them unless she held on, yet she had no strength left. Her head leaned weakly against his chest. "They'll never forgive you." He knew she was right. The village would not see his choice as mercy, but as betrayal. Still, the thought of leaving her here was unbearable. He had seen too much cruelty already. He would rather face their anger than carry the silence of doing nothing. As he adjusted his grip, his eyes caught something strange in the shadows of the well. Carved into the damp stone were faint markings, lines and shapes he recognized from old stories told around fires. They were tribal signs, etched long before the well had been built. They spoke of the earth as alive, of water as sacred. His chest tightened as he realized the villagers had built their well over a place once holy. Perhaps that was why fear lingered here, why they whispered of curses. It was not the woman they feared, the truth buried beneath their own homes. The woman stirred weakly in his arms, spurring words in her own tongue that he could not fully understand. Yet the tone was clear. Please, perhaps gratitude. He pressed his forehead against hers for a brief moment, a silent promise that he would not abandon her. Above, the night remained quiet. No footsteps, no voices, no one returning to see if she had perished. The village had sealed its choice, and he had sealed his own. He shifted her so that she could grip the rope. Her hands trembled, but he guided her fingers around the rough strands, steadying her grip with his own. "Hold tight," he said softly. "I won't let you fall." Her eyes searched his in the dim light, full of doubt and fear, but also of fragile trust. He knew he had only moments before her strength would fail completely. The climb would be slow, dangerous. If the rope snapped, or if she slipped, both of them could be lost. Yet he felt no fear now. What he carried was heavier than fear. It was the burden of knowing that to do nothing would haunt him forever. He began to climb, pressing his body close to the stone walls, his muscles straining as he lifted both their weights together. The rope creaked, his hands burned, his chest ached with the effort, but still he climbed. The woman clung to him as best she could, her breath shallow against his skin. The pale circle of light above grew larger, but with it came the weight of what waited. He imagined the village waking to find her alive. Would they try again to silence her? Would they turn on him? He pushed the thoughts aside. First came survival. Everything else could wait. Yet even as he climbed, the strange carvings on the stone seemed to press into his mind. He felt as though the well itself held stories too old to be forgotten, secrets the village had tried to bury. Perhaps saving her was not only an act of mercy, but part of something greater, something tied to the land itself. Her whisper broke into his thoughts. Why? Why would you risk everything? His jaw tightened as he pulled them higher. Because silence is worse than death. The words echoed in the well, bouncing back to him like a vow. The night above stretched endlessly. the prairie winds carrying the scent of dry grass and distant smoke. Somewhere out there, the world was moving on. Trains rushing across rails, cities growing, wars being fought. Yet in this small corner of land, everything came down to the rope, the stone. The weight of two souls climbing out of darkness. His arms trembled with effort, but he would not stop. Each breath was sharp, each movement a test of will. Yet the thought of her voice crying alone in the darkness pushed him upward. At last they neared the edge. The stone rim was close enough to touch. He braced his body, pushing her upward with the last of his strength, guiding her trembling hands to the surface. She gasped as her fingers found the solid edge, clinging as though to life itself. But as he prepared to lift himself out, a sound froze him in place. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Someone was approaching the well. He pressed himself against the stones, his breath quiet, his muscles tense. The woman clung to the edge, her eyes wide with new fear. The footsteps drew closer, crunching against the dirt, until a shadow blocked the pale light above. A figure stood at the rim of the well, looking down. The lantern light behind them cast no clear face, only a dark outline against the stars. The man's heart pounded, his hand tightening on the rope. He had made his choice, but now he would face the consequences. Above, the figure shifted, peering into the blackness. Silent as the grave and the well, which had heard every secret of the village, waited to see what would happen next. The figure above leaned forward, and the faint glow of a lantern flickered against their outline. The man held his breath, every muscle tight, the rope straining under his grip. The Apache woman pressed herself against the stone rim, too weak to pull herself over, her eyes wide with fear. Whoever stood above had seen them or would in another second. A voice broke the silence, low and cautious. "You shouldn't be here." The man recognized it. It was the blacksmith, a broad-shouldered villager with a soot-stained face. He was no stranger to cruelty, but he was not the loudest voice in the crowd either. Still, his presence here meant danger. "You heard her cries," the man said from the shadows of the well, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. The blacksmith shifted, lantern light trembling in his hand. "I heard, but I didn't come to save her." His tone carried both hesitation and warning. "If they find out you did, you'll never set foot in this town again." The words cut like the edge of a blade, but the man expected no less. He knew what it meant to stand apart. The blacksmith lingered for a moment longer, then set the lantern down by the rim of the well. "Hurry, before someone else comes." And with that, turned and walked away, his heavy steps fading into the distance. The man exhaled, his grip tightening on the rope. With one last push, he lifted the woman over the edge. Her body collapsed onto the dirt, shivering, her breath ragged but steady. He pulled himself up after her, his chest heaving, his hands raw and bleeding from the climb. The village was still, the cabins dark. But silence never lasted long in a place where gossip traveled faster than wind. He knew word would spread come morning, and the story would not be one of mercy, but of betrayal. The woman stirred, her voice faint. "They'll hunt us." He nodded, knowing she spoke the truth. "Then we don't give them the chance." He helped her to her feet, steadying her trembling body. She leaned against him, too weak to walk alone, her soaked dress clinging to her. Together, they moved through the shadows, away from the square, away from the accusing stones of the well. The prairie stretched beyond the village, endless fields of tall grass swaying in the night breeze. Somewhere out there lay freedom, but also danger. Riders could track them, and the land itself held its own hardships. Still, he knew they had no choice but to leave. As they slipped past the last cabin, a curtain shifted. Behind a small window, a pale face watched them. The baker's wife, kind in whispers, cruel in public, had seen them. Her eyes narrowed, her lips pressed tight. She would not cry out now, but by dawn. Her tongue would spill the tale to anyone willing to listen. The man quickened his pace, guiding the woman toward the open land. Every step felt heavier, so the weight of the entire village pressed against his back. Behind them, the well sat silent, but it held more than their secret. Deep within its stones, the carvings he had seen lingered in his mind. Old markings, tribal stories hidden beneath water and earth. He wondered if the village's fear of the woman had less to do with her and more with what the well itself represented, a truth too uncomfortable to face. The woman's voice broke into his thoughts. This land remembers. They cannot wash it clean. Her words struck him deeply. He had felt it too, the sense that the earth itself carried memory, that the land spoke in ways the settlers refused to hear. The well built on sacred ground was a wound, and throwing her into it had only deepened the scar. They reached the edge of the prairie, where the grass grew taller and the dirt path thinned. He helped her sit beneath a lone oak, its branches stretching wide, its shadow giving them cover. She leaned back, her breath still shaky. "Why do they hate me so?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. "Because you remind them of what they took," he said quietly, "and they fear what they don't understand." She closed her eyes, as though his words only deepened her sorrow. He watched her, feeling the pull of questions that had no easy answers. He had lived between both worlds, belonging fully to neither, but in her presence he felt a strange kinship. She, too, had been cast out, not because of who she was, but because of what others chose to believe. The night stretched on, but rest would not come. The man kept watch, every sound of the prairie sharpening his senses, the rustle of grass, the cry of an owl, the distant howl of coyotes. He thought of the blacksmith, of the brief flicker of hesitation in his voice. Not all in the village were blind, though. Fear made cowards of many. Perhaps there were cracks in the wall of silence. As dawn neared, the sky painted itself in pale hues of gray and pink. The woman stirred, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "What now?" she whispered. He looked toward the horizon, where the land stretched into rolling hills. "We move, before they wake." But the village had already begun to stir. Smoke rose from chimneys, dogs barked, doors creaked open. Soon, whispers would spread. Soon, the hunt would begin. They left the shelter of the oak, moving swiftly through the tall grass. Her strength was returning slowly, though she leaned on him often. He carried her when she faltered, his muscles burning, but his resolve unshaken. By mid-morning, they reached a ridge overlooking the valley. From there, the village looked small, its cabins scattered like broken teeth around the square. The well stood at its center, a dark circle that seemed to watch them even from afar. The woman stared at it, her jaw tightening. "It will not forget." The man followed her gaze. "Neither will we." They pressed on, the sun climbing higher, its heat pressing down. The prairie stretched endlessly, but he knew of places where water could be found, where trees gave shelter, where trails of buffalo still lingered. He would take her there, far from the eyes of the village, yet even as they walked, the weight of pursuit hung heavy. At any moment, riders could crest the hills behind them. The thought gnawed at him, but he pushed forward. As the day wore on, he began to notice signs. A broken branch, hoof prints in the dirt, the distant echo of voices carried by the wind. They were not alone. The woman sensed it too. She touched his arm, her eyes sharp, despite her weariness. "They come," he nodded, his jaw set. He had known this was inevitable. The village would not let go so easily. To them, her survival was not just disobedience. It was defiance against their power. Challenged to the silence they had chosen, by late afternoon, they reached the edge of a dry riverbed. The cracked earth stretched wide, the remains of water long gone. He led her across quickly, knowing tracks would be easier to follow here. On the far side, he searched for a place to hide. They found a small grove of mesquite trees, their branches thick enough to shield them. He helped her settle beneath the shade, then crouched low, scanning the horizon. Dust rose in the distance, the unmistakable sign of riders. His heart pounded, but his mind stayed clear. He had faced danger before: storms, wild animals, men who thought strength gave them the right to take. But this was different. This was not a fight of survival alone. This was about truth, about refusing to let fear dictate what was right. The woman reached for his hand, her grip weak but steady. "They will not stop until I am gone." He looked into her eyes, seeing both the fear and the fire there. "Then we don't let them find us." The riders drew closer, their shouts faint but growing. He felt the tension coil inside him, every sense alert, every muscle ready. The grove offered some cover, but not enough if they searched carefully. The woman whispered something in her tongue, words he could not fully understand. But the sound carried strength, like a prayer to the land itself. He held her hand tighter, grounding her, grounding himself. The dust rose higher. The riders were near, and the grove the dry riverbed. The endless prairie all held their breath, waiting to see what choice would be made next. The dust cloud in the distance grew larger, rising above the horizon like a storm rolling toward them. The riders were coming fast, their shouts carried by the wind, their silhouettes flickering in and out of view as the prairie grass bent in waves beneath the sun. The man crouched low in the shade of the mesquite grove, every nerve alive, his breath steady but heavy with the weight of what was to come. The Apache woman leaned against the trunk behind him, her body weary but her eyes sharp, her spirit unwilling to break. "They are close," she whispered, her voice thin but certain. He nodded, watching the dust trail with an intensity that made time slow. He could hear the faint drumming of hooves now, feel the tremor in the earth under his hands. The hunt had begun in earnest, and it was only a matter of time before the riders reached the grove. He knew the land well. He knew how the prairie twisted, how dry riverbeds could conceal or betray, how shadows stretched long in the evening light. But the men chasing them were not strangers to the land either. They were villagers, hunters, ranch handsmen who had lived off this soil, who carried the determination of people who believed they were protecting their homes. To them, the woman's survival was a threat, and he was now bound to her fate. The woman pressed her hand weakly against the earth, closing her eyes as though listening to something beyond the sounds of horses and men. "The land remembers," she murmured again, almost to herself. "It does not forget." He wanted to ask what she meant, but there was no time. The first of the riders crested the ridge, their outlines clear now, rifles strapped to their saddles, their hats pulled low. They scanned the open land, shouting to one another, their voices sharp and eager. The man pressed his back to the trunk, pulling her closer into the shadows. They could not move yet. Any step into the open would betray them. The grove shielded them for now, but not forever. The sun was lowering, throwing long shadows across the prairie, but light still caught on the rifles glinting at the riders' sides. One of the horses whinnied, and a rider pointed toward the dry riverbed. Tracks. The word carried clearly on the wind. The man's stomach tightened. They had found the trail. He held his breath, waiting. The riders would cross the bed, follow the signs, and then, if fortune betrayed them, find the grove. The woman looked at him, her eyes wide but steady. "You could leave me," she whispered, her voice raw. "They want me, not you." He shook his head firmly, his jaw set. "They've already made me part of this. There's no going back." Her lips trembled, but she said nothing more. She only gripped his arm, her touch light yet urgent. The riders entered the dry riverbed, their hooves striking the cracked earth with heavy thuds. Dust rose again, swirling around them as they leaned forward in their saddles, studying the ground. One dismounted, crouching low to inspect the prints. His shout confirmed the fear. They came through here. The group spurred forward, the sound of pounding hooves shaking the ground. The grove shivered with each beat, leaves trembling overhead. The man crouched lower, pulling the woman into the darkest corner, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his side. He had no rifle, no advantage in weapons, only his strength, the land, and the hope that the shadows might hold them long enough. The riders split as they crossed, some galloping north, others south, circling the edges of the grove. His heart pounded, each beat loud in his ears, as he pressed himself into the bark, willing the leaves to swallow them whole. A rider slowed, his horse stepping close, its nostrils flaring as if it sensed them. The man held still, every muscle locked, the woman clinging silently against him. The rider peered into the grove, his rifle across his lap, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The man could hear the blood rushing in his own ears, could feel the tension in the woman beside him. Then another shout broke the moment. Tracks keep going east. The rider turned his horse sharply, galloping off to rejoin the others. The grove shook as hooves thundered away, dust drifting back into the air. The man exhaled slowly, though his chest still felt tight. They were safe for now, but the chase would not end. The riders would sweep the prairie until night swallowed their trail. And even then, the village's hunger for silence would not rest easy. He looked at the woman, her face pale but resolute. "We move again. We can't stay here." She nodded weakly, pushing herself to stand. He steadied her, his arm firm around her as they slipped from the grove, moving quickly but quietly toward the ridge that led deeper into the wild land. The prairie stretched endless ahead, dotted with low hills and scattered trees. Offering both cover and danger, the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red. Shadows lengthened, and the first chill of evening touched the air. They climbed the ridge, pausing at the top to look back. The riders were still scattered, their dust trails cutting through the land, their voices faint but persistent. The village was far behind now, a small shape fading into the horizon. But the danger had only grown sharper. As they descended the far side of the ridge, the woman stumbled, her legs trembling. He caught her before she fell, his grip steady. She looked up at him, her eyes full of both fear and something else trust. "It's fragile but real. You should not have done this," she whispered. "But you did." He said nothing, only adjusted his hold on her and pressed forward. Night fell, bringing with it a blanket of stars across the sky. The prairie, vast and quiet, seemed to breathe around them. But with the dark came new fears, the cries of wolves, the rustle of unseen movement in the grass. The knowledge that torches could still rise in pursuit at any moment. They found a shelter in a shallow hollow between two hills. Where the earth dipped low and the grass grew thick, he helped her lie down, covering her with his own blanket. Her breathing steadied, though her body still shivered. He sat beside her, keeping watch, his knife resting across his knee. The silence pressed in, heavy with waiting. He thought again of the carvings in the well, of the old stories hidden beneath stone and water. The woman's words echoed in his mind, "The land remembers." He wondered if their flight was more than escape, if it was tied to something greater, something buried deep in the earth itself. The night stretched long. He fought against sleep, listening to every sound. Once, he thought he heard hoofbeats far off, but the sound faded. Once, he saw a shadow move against the starlight, but it was only a coyote slinking through the grass. The woman stirred, murmuring in her language, dreams or prayers spilling from her lips. He could not understand the words, but the tone carried strength, so she called on something older than fear. By dawn, the prairie was silver with dew, and the horizon glowed with pale light. He shook her gently awake, helping her sit. Her strength had returned little by little, though her face was still drawn. "We must keep moving," he said softly. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "They will not stop. Not until one of us falls." Her words hung heavy, but he pushed them aside. They began their march again, their steps quiet but steady. Each hill, each turn of the land brought them deeper into the unknown, yet the riders were not far. By midday, the sound of hooves returned, louder now, their shouts sharper. Dust clouds rose behind them, chasing across the hills. The man's jaw tightened as he pulled the woman along, urgency burning in every step. The land narrowed ahead into a rocky pass, cliffs rising on either side. It was both a refuge and a trap. He knew they had no choice but to take it, for the open prairie would leave them exposed. They entered the pass, the rocks closing in, the air cooler in the shadows. Their footsteps echoed against stone, each sound magnified. The woman gripped his arm tightly, her breath quickening. Behind them, the hoofbeats grew louder, echoing through the pass. Shouts followed, bouncing against the cliffs. The riders had found them. The man pulled her deeper, the knife in his hand, his muscles coiled with tension. The pass twisted, narrow and sharp, and the walls seemed to close tighter with each step. The woman looked at him, her eyes fierce despite her exhaustion. This is where it will happen. The hoofbeats thundered closer, the shouts of the riders filling the air. Dust swirled in the narrow space, choking and heavy. The man braced himself, his heart pounding like a drum. Every choice, every step, had led them here. And as the riders surged into the mouth of the pass, their torches burning, rifles gleaming, the moment of reckoning drew near. The chase was over. The confrontation was here. The smoke from the burning barn still hung in the night air, curling upward like the final sigh of a battle that had been fought too long. The villagers stood scattered across the dusty road, their faces pale in the glow of the flames, as though they could not believe what had unfolded before them. For years, whispers and fears had kept their hearts locked tight. But what they had witnessed tonight had torn those locks apart. The truth about what had been done to the Apache woman could no longer be denied, and the courage of one man who had dared to stand against them would be carried in their minds for as long as they lived. The man stood near the well, his hands scraped and raw, his chest heaving from the fight that had nearly broken him. He had not only battled with the ropes and the cold stone that threatened to claim her life, but with the weight of the entire town pressing against his back, the cries of the woman, the injustice of her suffering, and the shadows of those who had conspired to silence her had all led to this moment. And now she stood beside him, trembling but alive, her eyes reflecting both terror and gratitude. The crowd that had once turned their heads away in silence could not meet her gaze now. Shame had finally found them. The village elder stepped forward, his cane tapping against the hard-packed dirt. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of decades. He spoke not to the man who had saved her, or to the woman who had endured such cruelty, but to the people who stood frozen. He told them of the cost of silence, of how fear and hate had turned their hearts against their own humanity. He reminded them of the day they allowed anger to drive their hands, and how, in that moment, they had betrayed everything they claimed to hold dear. His words cut through the air like the ringing of a church bell on a quiet morning. It's impossible to ignore. The woman's voice, when it finally broke through the silence, was fragile but clear. She spoke of the darkness she had felt at the bottom of that well, the hopelessness that had nearly drowned her, and the one voice that had reached her when all others had turned away. She did not speak of revenge, nor of punishment, but of the chance for the village to remember their humanity before it was lost forever. Her words fell on the people like rain over parched earth, and many lowered their heads, tears glinting in the firelight. The man at her side did not speak. He only watched her, his face set with the quiet strength of one who had risked everything and gained nothing but the knowledge that he had done what was right. Yet in that knowledge lay something greater than any reward, something the others had forgotten, the power of conscience. The children, who had only known the woman through the fearful stories their elders had told, crept closer to her. One small hand reached out and touched hers, and she smiled through her tears. It was then the people began to understand what they had almost destroyed, not just in her but in themselves. The air shifted, heavy with regret, yet touched by the faintest stirrings of hope. The barn collapsed at last, the flames swallowing the last of its timbers. The night was quiet once more, broken only by the crackling of smoldering wood. The people began to scatter, their footsteps slow, as though they carried more than just their bodies back to their homes. They carried the memory of the night they nearly lost themselves completely. Days passed. Though the village still bore scars of its choices, a change had begun to take root. The well was no longer a place of whispers, but of reverence. For it reminded them of both their darkest sin and their chance at redemption. The woman walked among them again, her presence no longer hidden in shadows. And though many still struggled to meet her eyes, they offered her space, respect, and, in time, trust. The man who had answered her cries remained quiet, tending to his fields and keeping to his work, but the people never forgot what he had done. Children watched him with wide eyes, and mothers pointed him out as an example of courage, not because he had been stronger than the rest, but because he had listened when others chose silence. As for the woman, she carried herself with a quiet dignity. She did not ask for their forgiveness, nor did she demand anything beyond the chance to live free of fear. Her story was whispered across the hills and through nearby towns. Spoken as a warning and as a light, the tale of the Apache woman who had been thrown into the well, and the one man who had refused to let her die years later. When the children who had witnessed that night had grown into adults with families of their own, the story had become part of the fabric of the village. It was told not with pride but with humility, a reminder of how close they had come to losing their humanity. And when those same children taught their sons and daughters, they always ended with the same truth, that sometimes it takes only one voice to change the fate of many. The land itself seemed to hold the memory. The fields grew green again, the seasons turned, and the well, once a symbol of cruelty, now stood as a marker of second chances. The woman, though scarred by what had been done to her, lived with strength that no one could strip away. She found her place not as someone to be pitied, but as someone whose endurance gave others reason to look inward at themselves. The man aged quietly, his hair turning silver, his hands worn from years of labor. He never sought recognition, nor did he speak often of that night. When asked, he would only say that sometimes the right choice is the one no one else dares to make. Yet in his silence lay the lesson the village carried long after he was gone. And so, the story lingered, passed down with the rhythm of time, never to be forgotten. It was a story of fear and cruelty, of silence and shame, but above all, of courage and the power of a single answer. For though they had thrown the Apache woman into the well to die, the echoes of her cries became the turning point of an entire village. It reminded them all that to remain silent in the face of wrong is to become part of it, and to speak, to act, to answer when no one else will, is to light the path back to what it means to be human. That was the truth they carried, the truth that bound them together, and the truth that even in the darkest of nights would always guide them home.